The Middle East is rich in oil reserves, providing a huge amount of the world's energy. But what it has in abundance in hydrocarbons, it lacks in a critical resource that is growing scarcer by the year: water.
Most people imagine Saudi Arabia as endless sand, unbearable heat, and oil fields stretching beyond the horizon. But beneath that brutal desert, something almost impossible is happening. Deep underground, hidden beneath layers of scorching earth and ancient rock, the kingdom has been quietly building one of the most ambitious survival systems in human history. And the strangest part is that it begins with a decision that sounds completely insane. Saudi Arabia spends billions of dollars turning seawater into fresh drinking water, only to pump enormous amounts of it back underground. At first glance, it sounds like a catastrophic waste. Why would one of the driest nations on Earth bury the very thing it desperately needs to survive? Rumors about the project spread for years, with many people believing the government was hiding some kind of secret underground reservoir beneath the desert. Others thought it was preparation for a future crisis nobody was talking about publicly. But the truth turned out to be far more shocking than conspiracy theories. Saudi Arabia had realized something terrifying. The country's natural water reserves were slowly disappearing, and unless they found a radical solution, entire cities could eventually face disaster. That fear pushed engineers, scientists, and planners toward a project so massive it reshaped the landscape of the nation itself. What they created beneath the sand was not just a pipeline or a reservoir. It became an invisible artificial river stretching thousands of miles across one of the harshest environments on Earth. And the deeper investigators looked into this hidden network, the more unbelievable the story. Saudi Arabia is one of the few places on Earth where modern civilization exists in direct defiance of nature. The country has almost no permanent rivers, no massive freshwater lakes, and rainfall is so rare that entire regions can go months or even years without seeing meaningful precipitation. Yet somehow, giant cities packed with millions of people continue growing in the middle of this unforgiving environment. Riyadh alone expanded into a massive global capital, surrounded by dry deserts stretching endlessly in every direction. Skyscrapers rose from the sand. Highways cut through barren land. Luxury developments appeared where almost nothing should survive naturally. But hidden behind the rapid growth was a dangerous reality few outsiders fully understood. Every new neighborhood, every farm, every industrial project, and every futuristic megacity dramatically increased the country's thirst. Air conditioning systems ran non-stop under temperatures that regularly pushed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Green parks had to be watered constantly. Massive agricultural projects consumed For decades, Saudi Arabia survived by tapping into enormous underground aquifers buried deep beneath the desert. At first, these reserves appeared almost endless. Powerful pumps pulled billions of gallons of fresh water from beneath the earth, supplying cities, farms, and industries across the kingdom. To many people, it seemed like the country had discovered a miracle hidden beneath the sand. But scientists soon realized there was a frightening problem with this water. Most of it was fossil water, ancient reserves trapped underground thousands or even millions of years ago, during a time when the Arabian Peninsula looked completely different from today. Long before endless deserts dominated the region, parts of Arabia were greener, wetter, and crossed by rivers that no longer exist. Rainfall soaked into the earth over countless centuries, filling giant underground chambers with water that remained hidden beneath layers of rock and sand. But unlike normal, renewable groundwater, fossil water does not naturally refill at meaningful levels. Once it is pumped out, it is effectively gone forever. Saudi Arabia had unknowingly been spending a resource that could never truly be replaced, and the pace of consumption became staggering. Massive wheat farming projects drained aquifers at alarming rates. Expanding cities demanded more water every single year. Industrial growth accelerated the crisis even further. Some experts started warning that certain underground reserves could eventually collapse under the pressure of over-extraction. The terrifying realization slowly became impossible to ignore. Saudi Arabia's modern growth depended on a hidden supply that was steadily disappearing beneath its feet. If those aquifers failed, entire regions could face severe shortages, unlike anything the kingdom had experienced before. Suddenly, the nation's greatest hidden advantage transformed into a ticking clock. Officials understood they needed an alternative before the situation became irreversible. That fear sparked one of the boldest engineering projects in modern history. Instead of waiting for disaster, Saudi Arabia decided to build something nature never gave them in the first.
Once Saudi Arabia realized its underground fossil water could not sustain the future forever, the country faced a terrifying question. How do you supply millions of people with water in a place where nature provides almost none? The answer they chose sounded almost impossible. If rivers did not exist naturally, they would simply build one themselves. Quietly, engineers began constructing one of the largest underground water transport systems ever created. The project stretched across mountains, deserts, and massive empty regions where temperatures regularly became dangerous for human survival. Over time, thousands of miles of giant pipelines spread beneath the kingdom, forming an invisible network capable of transporting water from the coast deep into the interior. The numbers alone sounded unreal. The total system eventually stretched roughly 8,700 miles, making it longer than many of the world's most famous natural rivers. But the true challenge was not simply the distance, it was the environment. Engineers had to cut directly through solid rock formations in the Hejaz Mountains while also battling shifting sand dunes, dust storms, and heat intense enough to damage equipment. Workers often operated during the night or early morning because daytime temperatures became unbearable. Specialized machines bored tunnels through dense granite, while deep trenches were carved across remote desert regions. Every section of pipeline had to withstand brutal conditions for decades without failing. Unlike ordinary above-ground canals, most of this artificial river remained buried beneath the earth. That decision became critical for survival. Surface water in Saudi Arabia would evaporate rapidly under the desert sun, wasting enormous amounts.
Saudi Arabia's next challenge seemed almost as impossible as building the underground river itself. Even with thousands of miles of pipelines ready to transport water across the kingdom, there was still one major problem. The surrounding seas were filled with salt water that humans could not safely drink. But instead of seeing the ocean as useless, Saudi Arabia decided to transform it into the foundation of its survival strategy. Massive desalination plants began rising along the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, creating giant industrial complexes capable of converting seawater into fresh water on a scale the world had rarely seen before. Inside these enormous facilities, advanced filtration systems and thermal technologies stripped salt and impurities from the water, producing millions of gallons of clean water every single day. The process became one of the greatest engineering achievements in the modern Middle East. Some plants grew so large they could supply entire cities by themselves. The Ras Al Khair facility became one of the most famous examples, producing staggering amounts of fresh water daily while supporting both residential populations and industrial zones. Over time, Saudi Arabia emerged as the global leader in desalination, relying on the ocean to keep the country alive. But beneath the success was a dangerous reality many people ignored. Desalination required massive amounts of energy. Entire facilities consumed extraordinary levels of electricity around the clock. If the power stopped, the water supply could be threatened almost immediately. The process also produced concentrated brine, an extremely salty waste product capable of damaging marine ecosystems if handled improperly. Critics warned that the kingdom was becoming dangerously dependent on a technological system that needed constant energy and maintenance to survive.
Still, Saudi Arabia kept expanding the network because there was no realistic alternative. The desert could not provide enough water naturally, so the country manufactured its own future from the sea itself. Yet, even after producing all this precious fresh water, the kingdom made another shocking decision. Instead of sending every drop directly to cities, they began pumping enormous quantities back underground. And that mysterious move confused the world for years.
At first, the idea sounded absurd. Saudi Arabia was spending billions of dollars to desalinate seawater, transport it across deserts, and then inject huge amounts of it deep underground. Many people could not understand the logic. Why hide precious fresh water beneath the sand when the country already struggled with water scarcity? But the deeper experts investigated, the more brilliant the strategy appeared. Saudi Arabia realized that storing water above ground in desert conditions would be extremely risky. Surface reservoirs lose enormous amounts of water through evaporation under the relentless heat. In some regions, temperatures become so intense that massive percentages of stored water can disappear into the air every year. That meant traditional lakes and reservoirs were simply not efficient enough for long-term survival. Instead, engineers turned the desert itself into a giant underground vault. Through systems known as managed aquifer recharge, desalinated water was pumped deep beneath the surface into carefully selected geological formations capable of storing huge quantities safely underground. Rather than losing water, Saudi Arabia was essentially creating artificial aquifers beneath the desert. The cool underground environment protected the reserves from evaporation while preserving them for future emergencies. In many ways, the kingdom was treating water like money, placed inside a secure savings account. This hidden reserve could later support cities during periods of drought, infrastructure failure, or sudden spikes in demand. It also gave the country protection against future uncertainty as climate pressures continued growing across the Middle East. The strategy revealed something much bigger than simple water storage. Saudi Arabia was planning decades ahead, preparing for a future where fresh water could become one of the world's most valuable resources. The Saudi Green Initiative shocked much of the world because of its sheer scale. The kingdom announced plans to fight desertification by planting 10 billion trees across the country, an idea that sounded almost unbelievable considering the harsh climate of the Arabian Peninsula. For generations, people viewed large parts of Saudi Arabia as permanently barren landscapes dominated by heat and sand. Now, the country wanted to reshape that environment entirely. Officials described the project as a long-term effort to restore ecosystems, reduce pollution, cool cities, and slow the spread of desert conditions threatening communities and farmland. In rapidly growing urban areas, temperatures trapped by concrete and asphalt often became unbearable during summer months. The introduction of massive green spaces promised cleaner air, lower temperatures, and improved living conditions for millions of residents. Mega projects like NEOM and the transformation of Riyadh embraced futuristic designs filled with trees, parks, and green infrastructure. But behind the exciting vision remained one enormous question nobody could ignore. How do you sustain billions of trees in one of the driest environments on Earth? Natural rainfall alone could never support such an enormous environmental transformation. Fossil groundwater was already under pressure. That meant the entire success of the Saudi Green Initiative depended heavily on the kingdom's hidden underground water strategy. The buried desalinated reserves became essential for maintaining future forests, agriculture, and urban green zones without exhausting natural aquifers completely. In many ways, Saudi Arabia was attempting something humanity rarely tries at this scale. Instead of adapting civilization to nature, the country was actively attempting to redesign nature itself using technology, engineering, and long-term planning. Supporters called it visionary. Critics warned it could become one of the most expensive environmental experiments in history. But regardless of opinion, one thing became impossible to deny. Saudi Arabia was no longer thinking only about surviving the desert. It was trying to fundamentally transform what the desert could become in the future.